Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Anishinaabe lawyer and former chief of Couchiching First Nation, Sara Mainville. Mainville is a partner with JFK Law, LLP, and is based in Toronto. Her areas of practice include self-government and self-determination, advancing treaty implementation, and entertainment law. Sara, welcome to the show. Great to have you here in studio.
No, bonjour, Dennis. It's nice to be here.
Well, one of the things that we were interested in talking about, of course, was the often controversial and frequently quoted United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, more frequently referred to as UNDRIP. In Canada, that act received royal assent in 2021. Maybe what's your understanding of what UNDRIP was originally meant to do?
So UNDRIP, the International Declaration, was meant to basically welcome Indigenous peoples finally into the world of human rights. And one of the important key human rights of peoples, like Indigenous peoples in Canada, is self-determination. And so that was the intent of the world community, to recognize that and to put some obligations on states to work towards that important goal. And the act that was passed in 2021 was sort of a recipe of slow progress towards meeting that goal. Unfortunately, I think one of the clear criticisms that I think is probably well-deserved is it's going to take too long.
Taking long for sure. You know, it might be obvious, but why is there even the need for such an international act to recognize human rights for Indigenous peoples?
Well, it's really important. We're seeing with the New Zealand experience, right? Like, they have a very much a larger population, and they had made incredible advancements, but the political tides had turned, and there's nothing protecting those gains for them, and given the general the government and some of the general public opinion about Indigenous rights in New Zealand. So thankfully we have a constitutional recognition of Aboriginal rights, but unfortunately common law courts in Canada have put some colonial weights, some tests, including this test to prove Aboriginal rights, including the Aboriginal right to self-government. UNDRIP hopefully will open a door that has been closed by those tests. And that's our hope, that we actually can get some good work towards advancing self-determination and forms of self-government in Canada.
Well, like you say, this has been going on for a long time, adopted by the United Nations in 2007, but we're just learning in the past week or two here about some of the backroom dealings that Canada and Australia were working on together to weaken the declaration all the way back in 2002. What are your thoughts on some of those recent revelations that these two countries were trying to water this down?
It's shameful, but I don't think it's a surprise to me. I think I knew people that were actually going as delegates to some of those international conferences, and I knew that was in fact happening. So on one side, negotiating the original draft by Indigenous peoples to weaken it, and then voting no. That's shameful on the part of Canada, for sure.
Like you say, Canada, Australia, the US, New Zealand all voted against it in 2007. All countries with large Indigenous populations. Do you think that's why these countries opposed UNDRIP?
Well, I think there's two things. One is, what is the right to self-determination? In fact, someone is seen as progressive, as Barack Obama said, in finally agreeing to support UNDRIP, said that there is a specific Indigenous form of self-determination, which is a problem. In Canada, in addition, had problems with a right to self-determination that doesn't include a need to negotiate it. So that was one of their big problems, as well as this idea of free, prior, and informed consent, meaning that we would get out of this hamster wheel of consultation and accommodation and actually have something real, the need to have agreements the need to have processes that sought Indigenous people's consent.
Right. Well, British Columbia in 2019 became the first jurisdiction in North America to adopt UNDRIP, hailed as historic at the time, but First Nations have expressed frustration that there has been a lack of progress. Do you feel that, how do you feel, I guess, on how things have gone there, almost 5 years later now?
Yeah, I think every step taken is progress, but there's definitely criticism with every step in the way that, of course, governments are self-serving, right? They want to do things in a manner that they feel not only that they're taking a step, but they're also doing risk management so that the step doesn't create a wholesale change for the status quo. So, I mean, that's just the reality of how Canada has sort of evolved for Indigenous rights. I think what we also do as lawyers is we litigate and we bring things to court, and there has been some good judgments on UNDRIP in courts, including the important White and Montour case.
Which we'll certainly talk about here in a bit. But, obviously there are some, as you know, who view UNDRIP as a threat to Indigenous people's rights, but you see it as an opportunity. How so?
Well, again, it's those colonial Section 35 tests to prove Aboriginal rights. It's the costly litigation that you need to take these rights forward on Section 35. So basically, there's only two manners to prove rights, and that is through litigation or negotiation. And UNDRIP, I think, changes that and creates new agendas for the recognition through legislation. And so we've seen two important pieces of legislation, Bill C-92, as well as Bill C-15, which is now the UNDA or the UNDRIP Act, that recognizes rights, recognizes, brings tools that Indigenous peoples can take to the table to change unilaterally created government policy like the inherent rights policy in a real way. And also there's this national action plan process. I mean, I'm becoming a little bit more critical of that, but there is still room to negotiate some good things like gaming jurisdiction for First Nations.
You mentioned a couple there, but what do you think are some examples of where a First Nation has benefited from UNDRIP being in place? So
the Blueberry River case, so the Yahi decision. So this is a case that normally would have been appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court of Canada, but the province of BC is an act of reconciliation, decided not to appeal that decision and to work in a real way with that First Nation on dealing, and it looks like a great, impactful plan to deal with the cumulative impacts of development around that First Nation's traditional territory, and a real sustainable plan for the First Nation themselves to improve the sustainability of that territory.
Now, you wanted to address some of the misconceptions around UNDRIP. What do you see as being some of the misconceptions?
Well, I think one of the main misconceptions is that there was an original draft of the declaration that we should all be looking at. I do think in some situations it's important to recognize that draft was drafted by Indigenous peoples, but it wasn't the draft that was adopted in General Assembly by the UN. I have a very similar example with my treaty. We have a document that we use to bring to the treaty negotiations, and it's the 1869 list of demands. And we don't say that those lists of demands are our treaty. We know we negotiated. And so that's the similar thing with UNDRIP. UNDRIP was negotiated, and we've seen through the reports of a couple of weeks ago that maybe in bad faith, but it was negotiated. And what has been adopted by the General Assembly has real teeth. It is a real tool that can be utilized to push states to do the right thing, as far as, in some ways, fast-tracking the adoption of certain articles in the Declaration.
What, I guess, was left out from the Indigenous draft to what ended up being adopted?
Well, certainly there's more vague language. There's more vague language, and again, We know that the states didn't want wholesale change in the beginning. They wanted to negotiate and have the room to negotiate certain things. That's not to say that the Indigenous Peoples Draft isn't a better way to view some of these rights and some of the state accountability measures, but really legally the declaration is the only tool we have to legitimately use in the UN system and with our state partners.
How can Indigenous peoples, do you think, take better advantage of UNDRIP, which again was passed here in 2021, given royal assent?
Well, I think unfortunately what's happened because of in social media, there's a discourse that you're sort of on a termination track of terminating your rights. I totally disagree with that. There are ways, and that's the role of lawyers, right? There are several tools that are available, including UNDRIP, but it could be a sharp instrument, and so you need someone to help you navigate and utilize those tools in a real way, and that's the role that lawyers should take seriously with the UN Declaration. Like anything, it has two sides to it, and we need to be careful. I think there is a tremendous opportunity in the action plan to make some real substantial changes on things like the Section 662 cutoff in the Indian Act. We should be pushing much harder on that. UNDRIP helps. It's a real thing in communities. There's lots of discourse going around the fact that some families, they're divided. They have children who have status and children who don't, or grandchildren who have status and grandchildren who don't. Mm-hmm. That's a real impact, and we actually could make that change by all agreeing to push against, to make the government agenda move faster on that.
Well, we know for sure Russ Dival's out there probably gritting his teeth right now over what you just said there, but we did a whole episode with Russ on this, and we'll put it in the web story for people to watch. Sarah, we just got to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Anishinaabe lawyer Sara Mainville. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Anishinaabe lawyer Sara Mainville, and we've been focusing a lot on the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous peoples and what you feel are some of the misconceptions and opportunities around UNDRIP. But you've been a lawyer for nearly 2 decades now. What was it that appealed to you about law?
I was actually one of those few kids that always wanted to be a lawyer. So my parents used to have me debate different people, like around politics and things like that. I've always wanted to be a lawyer. I read voraciously. But I think one of the things about the law was this idea of self-government. And so when I did my undergrad, it was a school where a lawyer, Leroy Littlebear, is pretty famous in the law community, was there teaching, about what was happening with Section 35. It was just like such a rich area to think about and to advocate for, my own community and my nation, the nation in Treaty 3.
We do speak to a lot of lawyers on the show because it seems to be a profession that a lot of Indigenous peoples like to get into. Were there many other Indigenous law students at the time for you when you were?
I was the only Indigenous law student, I think, in my year, and there's, I think, 3 law students in the entire law school when I was going to law school.
You mentioned one lawyer there, but were there others that you had looked up to as possible mentors or people that you hope to be like one day?
Sure. I think like Leroy Littlebear was one. Sackage Henderson is someone I enjoy having conversations with. Wilton Littlechild. Really respect all the hard work he's done and the hard choices that he's made. And and then I'm working with one closely, Burn Christmas from Member 2. I really enjoy the work he's doing because he's doing a lot of big deals.
Was it? Yeah, they are out there for sure. Was it television shows or books that you were reading that you knew at a young age that law was where you wanted to go?
I think it was I think actually it was the politics, and most of the leaders in Indigenous politics were lawyers.
Right. Did you, as an Anishinaabe woman, did you have any, challenges going through law school?
Sure. Like, I think one of the things is I was the first in my family to go to university, and certainly the first in my family to go to law school. A lot of the students had, family members, parents, grandparents that were lawyers or judges, and so. But I did have a mentor, and that mentor really helped me, do all the right things when I went to law school. And I really appreciate that advice that I had. I think I made a lot of good moves as far as what I did, what I concentrated on, and the networks that I built.
Yeah, did you know what type of law you wanted to practice?
I actually wanted to be a criminal lawyer when I started, but then I started meeting some great environmental law profs. And then some of the recruiting that started to happen, I ended up articling at Eco Justice, which is an environmental law firm.
Right. Are there some memorable cases that stick out for you so far in the past 20 years?
Well, it's interesting. I know when Delgamuukw was going through, actually when I was in undergrad, some of the professors were helping the nation in some of the work that they were doing in mapping. So I did meet some of those folks that were on the long journey when I was in undergrad. And of course, Delgamuukw just came out when I was going to law school.
I think, speaking to the new generation of lawyers and some of the older generation, a lot of people wanted to go into, treaty rights, land rights,
Yes.
things like that. Now it seems a bit more diverse with this new generation, the type of law that they're practicing.
Yeah, there's a lot of young lawyers. One of our articling students at my law firm wants to do corporate commercial. And I think that's great. I think that's where the law is going. Most of these Aboriginal law firms, we try to be full service. We try to deal, with the awful Indian Act issues to self-government and modern treaties.
Well, one of the more maybe funner things to work on, perhaps, is you were recently certified to work in entertainment law. Can you tell us what all that entails?
So this is all to do with Jennifer Podemski, who I love. She's just a visionary person in Indigenous representation in the entertainment industry. It was actually, I think, an APTN production, Future History, that she was doing that I first met her. And then she reached out to me when she was doing some contracts and she wanted to recognize Indigenous law and recognize Indigenous concepts of ownership of stories. And so we worked together on that. And in fact, we're on a panel in the course that I took on entertainment law, explaining that journey and that experience. It is, I also did a lot of cannabis law work. It's something that's bright and shiny, and it's something that happens a lot quicker than an Aboriginal title claim or an Aboriginal rights. Like it happens, all of those other things kind of move glacially. Work on them for years and years, but this one was certainly bright and shiny. It's really interesting, and I know the junior lawyers that I work with are really interested in helping on that. So much change can happen through a story being told in the right way. So I'm really excited how that kind of will dovetail in the work that we're doing to advance Aboriginal rights.
Yeah, it must be nice to not have to work your entire career on something to see it through. But many people might not think that entertainment law is, the need for Indigenous peoples to be involved in that so closely. Why do you think it is so important?
Like I mentioned before, it's about the stories, because once the stories resonate with public opinion, then you see people saying, we need to do something about this. I think the story of the 215, it was ground shifting, and I think that we have to be really careful, because right now entertainment law is very transactional and could actually do some damage to some storytellers who have very important stories to tell. We want to make sure that they're treated in the way that they should be treated. And our stories, especially the old stories, finding ways to accommodate collective ownership of those stories and to respect protocol, all of those things. That's not my vision, that's Jennifer Podemski's vision, and I'm happy to help her with that.
Great points there for sure. Sara, more to talk about here. We just got to step aside for one more quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here with Anishinaabe lawyer Sara Mainville. Stick around. Well, welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Anishinaabe lawyer Sara Mainville, who is also the chief of her nation, Couchiching, which is I'm very familiar with, but in Treaty 3 near the Canada-U.S. border and Fort Frances, Ontario. You were just talking about offset here. You know, you're a managing partner now. How big of a deal do you think that is to be a managing partner of your law firm? There's
very few law firms that do have Indigenous managing partners. It's a big role to play in the visioning of the firm, and you know, sort of how we strategically maneuver in a very busy place in the law, and how we deal with client relationships, and sort of have sort of the, I guess, making sure that the way that we do relationships is done so that we're really creating concrete capacity for First Nations and really helping them in a real way towards self-determination. You know, I was just talking to one of our younger lawyers, and I said, like, some lawyers, it's all about the work. They don't really have a relationship with clients. That's not what we do. We have stronger relationships, and even if there is no work for us, we still keep in touch, and our role is really being helpful when we need to be helpful, and staying in our lane.
Good stuff. Nice to have that representation out there as well. Important for the next generation, I'm sure, as well.
I think so. I'm hoping that, you know, one of the things that I'm very active in doing is promoting other Indigenous lawyers, because I'm getting up there as a senior lawyer, and I'm making sure that I'm making space and I'm not taking up too much space. I think leadership also has to do the same thing, right? To allow for younger leaders to take space, and some people stay around a little bit too long. I take such great energy out of those relationships where I'm helping mentor or to foster a young Indigenous lawyer getting their name out there and doing great things.
Awesome stuff. Sara, down to our last 30 seconds here, but I did want to ask, what do you see as you know, some of the biggest legal matters in front of First Nations right now, which I understand 30 seconds isn't a lot to do, but what do you see as some of those big issues out there?
Well, there's a great case about tobacco in Quebec. It's called White Monteur, and it potentially can be a game changer as far as proving Aboriginal rights under Section 35, and really talking about treaty and nation-to-nation relationship, and Canada doing a lot more proactively and not ignoring Aboriginal treaty rights.
Awesome stuff. We'll have to pay attention to that and much more. Sara, thank you so much for coming in this week.
Oh, my pleasure. Miigwech.
That is all the time we have for the show this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. You can also listen to this show or any other show as a podcast. Those are available wherever you download your podcasts. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for being with us this week on Face to Face. We'll see you back here in 7 days.